The first accident I ever covered in What Really Happened was this one. This video serves as an updated version providing a more objective perspective based off the actual accident report, which is linked in the description. On Friday, July 8th, 2011, Ride of Steel at Six Flags Darien Lake was operating normally. A guest entered the red train through the exit using a wheelchair and the assistance of a family member. The guest boarded into row 11 and the rest of the train was loaded with riders from the standby line. All T-bar style restraints and seatbelts were checked by the ride operators and the train was dispatched from the station. The ride climbed its 208-foot tall lift hill and fell down the first drop. About halfway through the ride, as the train crested the third hill and the riders experienced a sensation of negative G-forces, the rider in row 11 was ejected from the train. Falling to the ground, the rider was killed instantly upon impact. The red train, now with one less rider, continued back to the station, where a fully loaded blue train had just been dispatched. As the red train pulled into the station, the riders informed the ride operators of the incident. After the ride was cycled empty, an investigation by the New York Department of Labor began. The investigation would examine every aspect of the incident, from the operation of the ride, the maintenance procedures, the design of the ride, and the alternate access programs employed at Darien Lake. They first looked at the maintenance of the ride. They examined the ride's lap bars on both the red and blue trains and determined that nothing had failed mechanically. The ride's trains had been maintained according to the manufacturer guidelines, and it was up to date on third-party inspections. They examined the design of the ride itself and found no inherent design flaws, though the ride model had a history of rider ejections. In 1999, a similar incident occurred on the same ride where a rider was ejected due to not fitting properly in the restraints. Due to the design of the ride, it was hard to judge whether the rider was properly secured by the restraint. This accident resulted in the addition of seatbelts to act as a measuring device for larger riders for the 2000 season. This was also added to two other coasters of a similar design at Six Flags America and Six Flags New England. In 2004, at Six Flags New England, a rider with unusual body proportions was again ejected due to it not being apparent to ride operators that they were not properly secured into the ride. This resulted in modified restraints on all three rides that were more secure and prevented larger riders from accidentally being admitted into the ride. Ride of Steel was operating with these new trains and seatbelts at the time of this accident. The investigation then turned to the alternate access procedures used at Darien Lake, as well as the operating procedures employed by the ride operators at the park. The ejected rider was a military veteran who was missing all of their left leg and hip, and their right leg was also amputated above the knee. Based on this information, it was not safe for the rider to ride any roller coaster at Darien Lake. Darien Lake's website from 2011 provides some basic information about access for guests with disabilities, such as that no rides at the park can accommodate wheelchairs, that many queues are not accessible for those with mobility impairments, and that guests who are affected by these impairments should go up the ride's exit or other alternate entrance marked by a sign. It also states that guests with certain size and physical proportions may not be able to ride all rides. Finally, it states that specific information is available at the ride and at guest relations in an Americans with Disabilities Act brochure. This would later be audited, and it was found that the mentioned brochure provided appropriate information about the rides at the park and their accessibility. It was also found that the signs at both the entrance and exit for Ride of Steel also provided this information, both sources explaining that riders with amputations above the knee were unable to ride Ride of Steel. The entire alternate access system at Darien Lake at the time was based around riders reading these warnings and operators knowing the restrictions of the ride they were currently operating. This left a large amount of room for error that ultimately led to this accident. Moving on to the operators themselves. Darien Lake and Hershen Family Entertainment, the owners of Darien Lake at the time of the accident, did not and still do not use a third-party ride operator certification. Instead, training was left to the park itself, and audits of ride operator performance were done only in the form of spot checks by managers at the park. Ride of Steel was operating with 3 operators on the day of the accident, one in the controls of the ride, one on the load side of the platform, and one on the unload side. It was found that the operator training was compliant with manufacturer guidelines, but employee retention of the material was poor. This was especially true when it came to comprehension and retention of the ride admission policy regarding guests with disabilities. Over the summer, the operators had become complacent with simply seeing someone arrive in the exit in a wheelchair and letting them on. They had become distanced from the safety-sensitive aspect of their job duties, and no one was there checking on employees to correct this oversight. With this information known, we can reconstruct the exact chain of events that led up to and occurred after this accident. On July 8, 2011, Ride of Steel was operating normally. Around 4:05 p.m., a guest who was in a wheelchair, missing all of their left leg, part of their left hip, and had their right leg amputated above the knee, visited guest relations and asked about boarding policies for guests with disabilities. Guest relations explained the policy at the park that allowed guests with certain disabilities to go up the exit of attractions. They offered the guest a brochure about ADA at the park and explained further what rides could accommodate certain body types. The guest declined this brochure, stating they already had one. It was never determined if this actually was the case. Before leaving guest relations, the staff explained to the guest that they would need to transfer to all ride units without help from staff members. At this point, the guest left guest relations and went out into the park. At around 5:30 p.m., they went up the exit for Ride of Steel, passing a warning sign that stated that riders with the same body dimensions as the rider that was attempting to board were not permitted to ride. The operator on the unload side of the platform signaled to the operator in controls not to open the gates in the next train, as there were guests in the exit waiting to be boarded. The red train pulled into the station and the guests in the exit were boarded. A relative of the guest with leg amputations assisted the rider with disabilities into row 11 of the ride. The loading gates were then opened and riders from the standby line filled the remaining 30 seats. The train was then checked by the two operators. This included one operator directly checking the seatbelt and lap bar of the guest with one missing leg. The red train was dispatched from the station. The rider stayed secure for the first 2 moments of negative G-forces on the first drop and first airtime hill. But as the train exited the first helix and crested the second airtime hill, the strong negative G-forces combined with the restraints' inability to secure riders without contact to their legs threw them from the train. The ejected rider fell to the ground below and was killed instantly after impacting the ground. The red train returned to the station and rolled right in, as the blue train had already been loaded and dispatched by the time the red train returned. Riders on the red train alerted the operators to what had happened. The operators opted to continue to cycle the ride and unload riders, allowing the blue train to crest over the lift. The fully loaded blue train completed the ride layout without incident, passing the scene of the accident on the previous train. The red train was emptied of riders and sent around empty to allow for the blue train to return to the station for unloading. This not only destroyed any kind of evidence that may have been left on the red train, but it also potentially endangered riders on the blue train, as at this point no one was aware as to what caused the accident or where the ejected rider was. The accident inspired changes at Darien Lake and to the entire alternate access system at parks as a whole. Darien Lake revised their entire training program and retrained every ride operator at the park under supervision of state inspectors. Darien Lake also introduced a ride operations auditor position, a position responsible for auditing ride operator performance throughout the year and retraining as needed. The position still exists today despite Darien Lake changing ownership multiple times since the accident. Many other parks have also adopted this idea and created ride operations auditing positions of their own. This accident also proved that all the signage and written warnings related to ride admission policy were not enough, and it takes a more defined system as well as a knowledgeable staff to prevent accidents. Today, ride operators are trained and audited on their knowledge of ride admission policy as it relates to the ride they are working. Additionally, the system for ride admission policy has been updated to provide more steps and evaluations of each rider that uses the system. Today, guests using alternate access at most parks must visit guest services or a similar location and be evaluated by someone trained on ride safety as it relates to rides at the park. This person will then issue them a pass that only allows that guest to board rides that they can ride safely. Ride operators will then receive this pass and perform a second check to ensure that it is safe for that rider to ride their specific ride. The accident on Ride of Steel at Darien Lake in July 2011 has become one of the most widely known ride accidents. It is still used as a case study for ride safety and has served as a catalyst for changing alternate access systems across the industry. All three troublesome Superman-themed Intamin coasters from the early 2000s have now been operating at their respective parks for over 12 years without incident. To learn more about the problems on Ride of Steel's sister coaster, watch this video. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.